Hello and welcome to another episode of EnVisioneering Exchange, the podcast where industry leaders discuss the most important topics in sustainability, climate change, buildings, and urban efficiency. I'm Vic Marinich with Danfoss, and I'm delighted to be the host of this podcast. You can subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Captivate, or wherever you get your podcasts. So today we have a bit of a handicap match. It's 2-on-1 here, and we have Chris Brown and Dave Yoder, both CO2 refrigeration experts at Danfoss and the intrepid hosts of the Controller Talk podcast. They're here today to talk about the adoption and implementation of CO2 in food retail. Chris, Dave, thanks for taking time to join the show.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, pleasure.
Awesome. So for the listeners who don't know you guys, so you host a popular podcast called Controller Talk. Can you maybe give a little bit of background on yourselves and on the podcast?
We can.
You can start on this one. Have at it.
Sure. Yeah. So we have 3 seasons in of the podcast at this point. Our goal was to bring information out to North America regarding our controls and how to use them and talk about things that aren't in the manuals and kind of give people some shortcuts and some hints. And yeah, it's been a very interesting process to put this out there and then get feedback and questions from people actually around the world. But it's been really good because when I go to California to do some work, the guy's like, "Hey, aren't you the podcast guy?"
Wow.
Yeah.
Famous,
Yeah.
huh?
Yeah. Semi-famous. Yeah. Just like this is semi-popular. Yeah. But no, I've been playing with controls now for about 34 years in this business. So got a few more to go.
Very nice. Cool. Yeah. So I guess this podcast is going to kind of be like, real technicians of HVAC talking with real technicians of the food retail realm, right? So, look out for battle. Careful for all the zany hijinks and shenanigans ensuing, right?
Yeah. But now it's Chris's turn to introduce his illustrious career.
Yeah.
I've been on before. Everyone knows me, right?
Yeah, exactly.
No, I'm 20 years in with Danfoss, give or take, and started under Dave's wing. And the podcast is something we try to supplement all the other information we've got out there, call centers and documents and everything else. Just another way to try to get a little bit more of that information out there for people to make it available to them.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's, especially when it comes to CO2, I think pretty critical, right? So maybe first, let's step back to food retail in general. And how is the refrigerant transition going in food retail? I guess, right, they've been moving away from traditional HFCs and onto CO2. So what's driving that and how's it going?
We know we're dealing with regulations, AMAC, other things from the EPA. That for us, at the end of the day, it's maybe to a smaller degree A2Ls, but to a larger degree and for a longer period of time here, it's CO2. So we're seeing customers and users, supermarket chains that have just made the decision to switch over, new stores, new systems to CO2 full bore. Others that are maybe trying it out to a lesser degree, but still implementing it some into their new stores. So it's really kind of anything that we're seeing in the market, a lot of the conversation, because it's new technology and things we have to get people up to speed on. Customers, technicians, top to bottom. It's really a lot of the conversation centered around CO2 for the last few years.
Yeah. A lot of it's can be regional too, based on state regulations, that sort of thing. It kind of drives those decisions.
Nothing like having 50 different sets of regulations to have to stay on top of, right?
Right.
So sounds like maybe we're kind of like at the base of the hockey stick curve here when it comes to CO2, right? I mean, how is it? How's the adoption of CO2 in the food retail industry right now?
There's some studies I've seen where I think if you go back 2 years, around 2023, I think the estimate was about 10% of all the supermarkets in the country you were looking at, 10% were CO2, and that's different system types that we might talk about here in a few minutes. By 2027, the estimates, they're looking at 30 to 40% of all the stores, when you look across everything in the U.S., are going to have CO2 in them. So it's been a slow grind for the last 10 to 12 years when they first started in the country, but it's really escalated quickly here in the last, 2 or 3 years where people decide to switch gears.
Coincidentally, just about the same time your podcast started, right?
Yes.
I'm just saying, right? Just saying. So.
Amazing timing.
Yeah. So how does that compare with the rest of the world, Dave?
Well, the rest of the world has been far ahead of us in some areas, especially. But for North America, it was more of a, let's see how this goes and where it goes. So now people are starting to get on board more, and they recognize that Danfoss has been doing CO2 for quite a while. So they're coming to us for some of the answers. But no, I think in general, it's been going pretty well, because now we're starting to, that curve, like you said, is starting to take off a bit. And there's more information out there. There's more sources of information. We're out there educating people, and, we're not just talking about it. We're getting out there into these sites. Both of us are at times, and helping people get those systems up and running, and then also educating them at the same time.
Right. You said we've got the contractor owner base saying, let's see how it goes. So kind of makes it sound like maybe there's still some hesitancy out there. Do you think that's because of maybe some misconceptions on CO2? Like I remember hearing, it's only good in cold climates, right? And lots of other things. Do you think that has a kind of a role to play in kind of what you're doing with education?
I think that's part of it. And the other thing that I'm hearing is that there are some people that think there's a lot more to learn about CO2 and being able to wrap your head around CO2. And some of the guys are like, hey, I only got a few years left. I don't know if I want to deal with this. And in some cases, they may say, you know what, I'm just going to stick with HFCs and let somebody else work on CO2. But for everyone that wants to back away from it, there's other guys that recognize that this is the future and they want to learn. And they know that they're not going to learn it overnight, but they'll just keep chipping away at it and they'll figure it out. And then that makes them more valuable.
So you mentioned a lot more to learn. I don't know, maybe Chris, you can dive into some more detail. How is a CO2 system different from your traditional HFC system, right? We hear things, transcritical systems, subcritical systems, cascade systems, right? Things that we're not used to hearing so much with, the good old 404A, for example, right?
I think it's two things that come to mind right away. One's the pressures. So in a lot of these different types of ways that the CO2 is being used, your pressures are higher. It could be 3, 4, 5, 6-fold maybe over what a technician might be used to with an HFC system. And then the other things you're talking about, you're starting to get into a little bit more of the properties of a refrigerant and that type of thing. But like you said, it's subcritical, transcritical, the refrigerants in some different states that you might not have been used to dealing with. And then the controls, for example, have to take that into account. And now you've got some settings maybe that you didn't have to deal with before on the old equipment types. And you've got to understand what numbers you're putting in for those as well.
So, and then, maybe a bit deeper dive into the components, right? Your typical HFC system, right? It's compressor, condenser, expansion, evaporator. How's that different? What kind of components are we talking about in a CO2 system?
So CO2, if we're looking specifically at maybe a transcritical design, for example, you've got a high pressure valve coming off of a condenser, gas cooler, we might call it for a CO2 system. And then where we have our liquid receiver that's typically storing the liquid from coming back from the condenser, you have a valve there to kind of relieve pressure back into the suction line. So you've got those two extra valves are the most commonly two added to a system. And then there's some enhancements, I guess you could call it, to a transcritical system where other things like a parallel compressor, ejectors, you start to get some of these energy efficiency things tied into it all. And those are extra components that could become part of that solution as well.
But those components are taking the place of your traditional, like say, there is no TXV or EXV necessarily, right, in a transcritical system, right? And you said, right, it's a gas cooler, maybe not a condenser. So we have to learn a little different language, right?
Without a doubt.
You still have your TXV. It's down at the case doing its job, and it's electronic. It's not going to be typically a mechanical device that you play with a couple times a year to get the superheat just right.
Right.
That's something we're trying to make sure in some of our conversations that people don't get too freaked out by it and think it's an alien spaceship or something, right? It's still a refrigeration system. There's a couple extra components, and it makes sense if you sit down and think about how they're being used. It's something you want to go through.
We've had customers over the last few years that were kind of thinking ahead, like, how do I make my system more efficient? So they started switching to case controllers. And now they're just adding the CO2 component. So for them, the learning curve is a little shorter. So it's not so bad when they look at it that way.
Do it in steps, kind of, right?
Yep.
So we talked, at least I remember hearing often, right, CO2 only good in cold climates. Are there other, misconceptions or things you're hearing out there in the market about CO2 that we can maybe dispel, some myths?
Well, that it's like ready to explode or something like that. Maybe that's one of them. But The opposite of a myth to me is seeing is believing. And we talked about going into the stores and getting them up and running and things like that. But for me, one of the interesting things here is that instead of walking into a compressor room with 16 compressors, or at least 15 anyway, or 12, you walk in and there's 8 compressors there. And that's it for a typical size store. And then we start talking about the properties of CO2 and the efficiencies. And guys are pretty amazed at what you can get it to do. And then on top of that, the customers are getting better at adding elements to pull heat out of it, to heat their hot water and their store and things like that. So yeah, it's evolving from let's just get it up and running to now let's start adding some features that we can really make this whole store more efficient.
More energy optimized,
Yeah.
right? And can you maybe go a little deeper on the application side on cascade systems? And is that something we're seeing more in food retail applications?
There was a time period a year or two ago when there was, and maybe some people are doing it. I saw a few stores where they did use cascade systems, and they kept the CO2 on the low temp side, used other refrigerants to cool that CO2. So it wasn't really a traditional CO2 system or anything, but it has its pros and cons, I'm sure. It gave people a taste of CO2, if nothing else. And that's what people did as kind of a test to kind of see, okay, how's this going to work? How much charge do we need on both different refrigerants? Now, do we need 2 sets of leak detectors, that kind of thing? So I think the general trend, though, is to make the whole store CO2.
Is it, so you think getting away from cascade systems? Cascade was maybe a first, again, kind of step in, maybe help mitigate some of the concerns on pressures and doing some of those other things in the system.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I've talked about this. When we talk these next gen refrigerant transitions, there is no cure-all, right? I mean, those us old people know from way back, right? It was kind of like, well, R22 just kind of worked everywhere and did its job everywhere and you almost didn't need anything else. But now, as we transition to the next gen stuff, whether it's the high pressures of CO2, right in there, we're talking 1,500 to 2,000 PSI. So high pressure, or it's the flammability of R290, or it's the toxicity of ammonia. I mean, it's a matter of picking what's the most efficient solution for that specific application and then mitigating the risks of whatever pressure, toxicity, flammability, right? I mean, we're just not, chemistry just isn't going to find that perfect molecule that does everything, right? And has zero downside risks, right?
Yeah.
So it sounds like there's a lot of maybe still a knowledge to be shared, maybe still some concerns from the market, but we're taking some steps in the right direction. I guess, and your podcast is a perfect example, right? It still needs to be a lot of education and discussion in the marketplace, right? So what are manufacturers like Danfoss doing to help get those customers? Ultimately, they have to be comfortable with what they're putting in their store, right? And comfortable that the people servicing it can service it properly and that the components are safe and everything else. So what are we doing to help make sure we build that comfort level?
Training's the big word there. I mean, there's the informal training of the material, like the podcast and other things, but then there's also the formal side of it where, for example, we have a mobile training unit for CO2 that has all these components that we're talking about that people might need to get comfortable with so that when they do go on the job site and they do see the stuff for the first time, they know what they're dealing with, they feel comfortable enough to tie into a controller and change a setting or work on a compressor, whatever it might be. And I think that's something that's kind of consistent across everyone when you look at the manufacturers like a Danfoss, as well as the OEMs, the equipment manufacturers that are bringing this all together into a package, down to the technicians at the end user level. It's really that kind of training is available for the most part across the board now, which is something that's been good to see over the last few years, where it was very limited before. And there was a lot of guys asking for it, but it wasn't necessarily available to them. Now it's a lot more available. And I think the content of it and just the general idea of how a technician is comfortable, again, walking away from one of these, I think that really helps out in the long term.
Yeah. And these YouTube videos are really able, there's so many out there and you're not losing any. You're only gaining every day, basically. And you can kind of pick out the ones that you really want to find and listen to and learn from and stop and start and whatever you want to do. But yeah, Chris is probably going to want to plug his 2.0 version of the mobile training unit.
Right.
Even more.
Yeah.
Yes, because it's almost ready to hit the road.
Oh, okay. And here, right, when we talk a mobile training unit, right? I mean, it's a 40-foot trailer decked out with a CO2 system or the components for a CO2 system on board, right? Where you can maybe play around a little bit, try to break things without breaking things.
It's a mock rack. So, I mean, yeah, it's fully functional, gas cooler, evaporator, compressors, the whole 9 yards with the controls to boot. It's, fully intended to replicate what you would see in a store. Maybe not to the degree of the number of compressors, for example, but definitely meant to replicate what you would see there so you can get a feel for it.
And so you are taking it on a tour, I assume. You pull up into whatever, Mickey D's parking lot or wherever it's going to be. And
whoever has the hottest coffee at
exactly,
the time. Yes.
Yeah, perfect. And then obviously some promotion ahead of time and bring in what? Contractors and users? Who are you targeting?
Yeah, I mean, anyone that it's relevant to, whether that's obviously the field side of it with a contractor or technician, but then also the engineering side with the OEMs and the end users. We have to let them know that, back to the beginning part of the conversation, CO2 is not something to be scared of or worry about. It's here it is right in front of you, up and running on a trailer. So to carry that over into a store with a refrigeration system similar to what you're used to, it's not going to be that big of a transition for you.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it might give some people the first chance to see a Bach compressor and start asking questions about those because it's outfitted with those.
So it sounds like we're heading in the right direction. Then maybe, Dave, how do you see what's the long-term outlook here for food retail and CO2? Sky's the limit?
I think it is. I think that there are a lot of people that are thinking CO2 is the way to go, especially for new stores.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen it done on remodels too. You just have to have the right amount of people and the right people to pull it off, because sometimes there's a lot of stuff going on overnight. But by morning, you can have the new set of cases ready to go. So remodels are possible. There's a lot of things have to get changed, and a lot of thought has to go into it, but I've seen it done. So it's not just new store builds where this comes into play. But I think there are a number of customers that are saying, hey, new stores, we're going to go CO2. And then we're going to think about whether we want to back up and start doing any kind of remodels with CO2 or add a condensing unit that's CO2 to take some of the load off the rack that's kind of overloaded at this point. Those are possibilities. But like anything else, cost is going to come into it as well.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
And right now, cost is up and down every day. So I think once that settles out, people will be able to make a better decision.
Cost on the refrigerant, you mean? Or the system or the components?
The components, everything from the cases to the rack to the valves, everything.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Sounds like we're heading in the right way. So look out, Europe, here we come, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Very nice. So maybe just the last question, anything you want to wrap up with? Anything we forgot to ask? Info on the MTU, how to find it, or other tools that you guys have to offer for CO2?
The place I always point everybody back to, we do have a webpage where we try to bring everything, condense it into one area. It's danfoss.com/supermarket support.
Oh, okay.
So the material we're talking about here, links to the podcast, training availability that we have, those are all areas that you can go to for that off of that webpage. Big idea, I think, is it's definitely all moving towards CO2. We're closing the gap with Europe, like you said. And we know the regulations are pushing everyone in that direction. They want to future-proof their stores, I guess is the term you hear sometimes.
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
So it's definitely going to be something that's here to stay when somebody moves in that direction.
Yeah, I think there's a core group of people that are getting really good at it, and they're going to get better, and then they will teach other people, and then they'll start dispelling those myths and learn how to use ejectors to make it more efficient and things like that. I think it's on the upswing.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Good. So that's it for this episode of EnVisioneering Exchange. I'd like to thank my guests, Chris Brown and Dave Yoder from Danfoss Controller Talk Podcast, for joining us.
Thank you, sir, for having us on.
Thanks,
again.
Yeah. So don't forget to subscribe to EnVisioneering Exchange on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Captivate, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And lastly, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate, review, and share it with your network. Thanks for listening, and talk to you next time.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the EnVisioneering Exchange podcast series are solely those of the individuals involved and not necessarily represent those of Danfoss LLC and its employees. Danfoss LLC is not responsible and does not verify for accuracy any of the information contained in the podcast series available for listening on this site. This podcast series does not constitute professional advice or services. This podcast, including Danfoss LLC and the producers, disclaim responsibility from any possible adverse effects of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and Danfoss LLC in this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility of statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about the guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast. The developers of the EnVisioneering Exchange podcast site assume no liability for any activities in connection with this podcast or for use of this podcast in connection with any other website, computer, or playing device.